I want to explain what it's like to be a conservative atheist, especially one who listens to conservative hosts of podcasts and pundits and whatever else, and agrees almost entirely on nearly all issues. The unfortunate chasm between a conservative atheist and a Christian, aside from the belief in God itself, which is another matter entirely, is the fact that they proclaim that the cause of all this leftist nonsense that's going on with the pretending like there are more than two genders and all of that other ridiculous stuff that's happening that we see on the news and we see in real life sometimes from the people with the purple hair and the blue hair and the green hair, and I see all the time in my classes having to watch these propaganda videos being told about how police are all racist and all this kind of nonsense, blah, blah, blah. It's all ridiculous. But according to the Christian right, if we can call it that, the basis of this is that they don't accept God as the moral objective foundation of their values, and so they can't have any objective values. And on top of that, they can't have any values other than moral relativism. Now that, I think, is the biggest talking point in this space, because it's something that's just accepted by all of these people and it's echoed by all of the pundits, and often proclaimed by the same pundits. It's not something that's ever challenged because everybody that listens to these shows agrees, with the exception of just me or the five of us or however many of us there are that are conservative atheists. The problem with this on a foundational level is who decided that we need an objective foundation for our morals. Taking aside the idea that A, we need an objective moral foundation, and B, this moral foundation must be my favorite fairy tale that I happen to be born into that my parents told me was true my entire life, and so it must be true, and that is the moral objective foundation. As Sam Harris says, who was a hero of mine until he went politically off the rails over the past 2 years, how is it that you came to the conclusion that we need an objective foundation for morals, but we don't need an objective foundation for physical health of humans? And Sam makes this point in several places. What does health look like? Well, there is no objective health. You don't go into a hospital and hook yourself up to a health-o-meter, and it gives you a score, and if you're above or below a certain score, that tells you whether or not you are or not healthy. That's not the way that it works. But we recognize some of the signs of health, and just as Sam says again, if you're vomiting all the time, or you're close to the brink of death, or you can't catch your breath when you first wake up and throughout the day, and you've got a splitting headache, you've got blurred vision, you have intestinal problems. All these things are signs that we are unhealthy, and we don't need an absolute objective moral foundation to accept that claim. So this is really the one area, and it's a byproduct of the God of the Gaps argument, where because of the fact that science as a whole has explained away all the things that people used to proclaim were the territory of God, now aren't. This is sort of the one last bastion of holding on to my favorite fairy tale that I can use against the non-believers. The problem is that it's abject nonsense. It's just there's no one there to challenge it. I have it's close to an objective foundation for moral values as one can have. I'm a psychology student. I'm about to graduate. The objective, if you can call it that, in reality it's subjective, but only to a very small extent. The objective moral values and the foundation for that set of moral values is the psychological well-being of humans. In this case, talking explicitly about humans. Being born a man and then later on pretending that you're not a man and that you're in fact a woman, and having other people reinforce this delusion is objectively unhealthy psychologically. And the most ridiculous thing in this area that we see is this claim, and it's been echoed on the Atheist Experience, which is one of those, a reason why I can't watch that anymore. I used to watch every single episode. Is that the claim is, ironically enough, especially for the Atheist Experience, all the suicides among quote-unquote trans people are because they're not accepted in society. Okay, well, that is a claim, just like the God claim, that needs evidence to back it up. There is absolutely no evidence that trans people commit suicide at a far higher rate than average people because they're not accepted in society. You need to prove that claim. You need to provide evidence for that claim for me to accept it. I do not accept it. Even if it is the case, it's directly analogous to you committing suicide because you believe the earth is flat and everyone around you tells you that you're wrong and that's not true and that's objectively false, and so you kill yourself for it, and then a bunch of people attack those people and say, well, that's not how his lived experience doesn't reflect that, you know, in his lived experience the earth is flat and he killed himself because of you. Either way, it doesn't matter. Now that is directly in keeping with conservative values and the Christian right in the United States of America, again, who I align with very closely on almost every issue, will proclaim that that's not true because the Bible says it isn't, and the Bible says it isn't because that's not what God intended. Well, that's also a claim for which we need evidence. In reality, it's just not psychologically healthy for human beings. My basis for my values is far more simple and rational, because at least we can prove human beings exist, than the idea that some invisible monster in the sky who gets jealous of who you're sleeping with said so. It's just abject nonsense. This also puts me in a position where I don't agree with the prevailing sentiment, because at this point, whether you're on the right or the left, you're supposed to swallow wholesale the entire ideology. Included in the Christian right ideology that issues that I do not accept objectively are the issue of abortion, and that one I think is another huge issue here. And I have no firm 100% certain stance on that. It's obviously immoral to say that you can get an abortion the day before the baby would be born, because it is obviously a fully formed human baby, and the only difference is that it's inside rather than outside. That's the position we're in. But it is absolutely not true that just because the Bible says life begins here or there, wherever you can find that in the Bible, that a day after a woman gets pregnant, that is a life and it's a fully formed human being. That is ridiculous. It's, if you find an apple seed and you chop it in half, you did not chop down an apple tree. So there's some line in there that must be drawn. But it's perfectly clear to me that the day after a child is conceived, that child is not a fully formed human being. The day before the child is born, it is absolutely a fully formed human being. So that's an issue that's absolutely up in the air. But I'm not required to accept wholesale what everyone tells me I ought to think who thinks like me on other issues, just because some book says so, or worse, some preacher who's interpreting some book says so. It's absolute nonsense. It's a very frustrating position to be in, and I listen to guys like Matt Walsh every day, Michael Knowles, love them. I love Ben Shapiro. I used to love Sam Harris also. I used to listen to all these people together. Just to make a note, I quit listening to Sam Harris because he has decided only to talk about Trump over the past year or two. with the exception of a podcast that has absolutely nothing to do with politics. If there's ever a point in the conversation where Trump can enter, Sam will inject it, much like the mainstream media, and it's just absolutely unbearable to listen to. I'm not a big Trump fan. It was absolutely my moral obligation as an American and as a veteran to vote for Donald Trump in 2020. And it had nothing to do with Trump. It had to do with the fact that the other candidate was and clearly is a communist. That was my moral obligation, and absolutely was the moral obligation of every other American. This is one of those primary things that has aligned me value-wise. I always have been aligned, but politically, I'm effectively on the Christian right now, even as an atheist. Because that is a zero-sum game. You elected a communist into the office of presidency, and we have seen the results of that. I'm in a position now where, yes, Christianity is a problem, and if Christianity were running rampant and our society was really based on Judeo-Christian values, it would be a law that we couldn't idolize anything except God, and that we had to kill homosexuals on sight because Jesus explicitly says to do so in the Bible. If you're an atheist and you haven't yet read the Bible or the Quran, I would highly encourage you to do so, because they are really, really horrible books. Despite what you hear on the mainstream media from other people who also haven't read the books themselves. I'm in a position now as a conservative atheist where I'm in some kind of extreme minority. I don't know if I'm the only one. I can't be. Statistically, that's unlikely to be the case. But it seems like everybody else on my side is also a Christian, and they are under the assumption that their values come from the Judeo-Christian philosophy. I believe that that's also nonsense, but it's in some ways true, and in some ways patently absurd, like in the case of killing homosexuals. But again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the greatest enemy to the United States of America at this point is the left. And I mean the entire left. So from the neighbor down the street that believes that men can be women, to Joe Biden, who also believes that, or even worse, he doesn't really believe it, and he knows it not to be true, but he pretends that he believes it, and is working with the person who lives down the street to instantiate communism in the United States of America. I don't have any idea if anybody's going to listen to this, or if it is compelling in any way, or if I'm just a rambling lunatic. I felt compelled to do something to speak out, because at this point, the conservative side is the only side that's making any sense about anything. Fauci obviously lied about a million different things. Joe Biden is obviously a corrupt criminal who was doing and is actively doing literally everything he accused Donald Trump of doing, on top of being a pederast. You can easily find photos online of his 15-year-old babysitter, who is now his wife, sitting on his lap while he was married to his first wife. I am a veteran in the United States military. I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. At this point, the Christian right and the quote-unquote white supremacists, who don't really exist in any significant capacity, are not a threat. I also actively work in military intelligence, and I am telling you objectively that is absolutely not true. The biggest threat to the United States of America are the people who are actively trying to destroy it. Now, this includes China and to some degree Russia, but the worst culprit of all are the people who are making laws to ensure that this happens in this country. So AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and all the other corrupt criminal monsters who are provably communist people in the Black Lives Matter terrorist organization, these are all people who are trying to actively destroy the rights and freedoms of United States citizens. And when you have a president getting on camera actively and openly and blatantly scoffing at the idea that freedom matters more than people wearing a mask while they're outside. That is a problem. And it's a problem that the Christian right acknowledges and sees, and the left is perpetuating intentionally. The one problem that the Christian right, or the conservative side at this point has, is they follow the data and the evidence on COVID and on what's on Hunter Biden's laptop and what's going on in Ukraine and all this other stuff. They completely ignore that requirement of evidence and proof for claims when it comes to God. That is the biggest problem. I cannot help whether or not I'm convinced by something. I either am or am not convinced by a statement, an argument, a proclamation, and the way you get there is you provide evidence for a claim. Now, the claim that God is real has never been supported by evidence and never will be supported by evidence, just like the claim that Santa Claus is real is not supported by evidence. In fact, it's objectively more likely that Santa Claus exists, because at least he's fundamentally less capable of doing magical, impossible things than God. So by definition, Santa Claus and unicorns and leprechauns are more likely to exist than God. We have really got to move past this, because this is the one area where we don't apply the same logic to our favorite fairy tale as we do to everything else. And when you do that, you seed the ground for example, the transgender folks to say, I'll apply evidence and logic to everything else, but on the issue of gender, I get to go with my fairy tale. You can't do that, because once you've seeded that ground to them, you have absolutely no basis to argue against it. I understand people don't realize this, but logically, it's as coherent an argument as possible. If you're going to accept that some magical fairy tale is true, they can have their fairy tale too. And that makes you logically incoherent and utterly unable to argue this point. I have no idea, again, like I said, if anybody's going to watch this, or if anybody's interested, or if I might be the only one, or if I'm completely insane and just missing something. But if there's any kind of audience for conservative atheist thoughts, I'll, I guess, record more stuff, but I just felt compelled to do something. I don't have any social media. I'm not involved with that stuff. I'm not interested in getting famous or making money or having my name or my face out there. I would simply like to speak on topics that I see as obviously in need of discussion that no one else is talking about. So, yeah, I hope that this helped you maybe in some argumentation or work through some thoughts that you've had if you're an atheist who sees that the left is obviously completely insane. But you can't help whether or not you're convinced that there's a God. So don't let anybody make you feel bad about that. It's pretty obvious that there is no God, and that's okay. And being an atheist doesn't mean that you are inherently Marxist or you're a communist at heart. None of that. It's not a prerequisite for being a totalitarian fool. And real quickly, the claim is another thing that Sam Harris mentions. The claim that atheism is responsible for the atrocities of the 20th century is also complete nonsense, because especially when it comes to secularism is completely separating church from state. That is the opposite of what all of the communist dictatorships did in the 20th century, because they enforced no church and no religious creed and replaced the gods that were believed by the people with themselves. That is just another religion minus the magical fairy tale stuff. So, if this reaches anybody, I hope it helps you. I hope maybe I'm reaching some people who think similarly to me. Maybe not. But if there's any kind of reasonable response to this video, I'll post some more and get into some more specific cases and issues that I think are important. But either way, I hope you have a good day. Don't let anybody make you feel bad for what you are or are not convinced of. The left is completely insane. Biden is a communist. And take it easy.